is now being recorded. Without wasting your time, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's session of Family Law. Those who didn't meet me yesterday, my name is Tabang. I'll be the captain of this ship this evening. So to get started, today we're going to be discussing engagement. So I do believe that some of you are probably engaged. Some of you may be married, or some of you may be single. But today we're going to discuss engagement. If any one of you has an idea of what an engagement is, you can put your hand up, and then the floor is all yours. Anyone? Okay, it looks like nobody knows what an engagement is, but there is no right or wrong answer. If you want to give it a try, that is how we all learn. So, Nelisiwe, my level, you raised your hand. Nelisiwe, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and then tell us what you think the engagement is.
When an engagement is the proposal, when your spouse proposes you for a hand in marriage.
Okay, that's a good answer. Thank you, Nelly. Is there anybody else who wants to give it a try? Okay, we shall continue. So I would say an engagement has probably two definitions. There is no right or wrong definitions. It depends on how the question is phrased and how many marks the question has. In my view, I would say an engagement is an agreement between one man and one woman to marry each other on a specific or determinable date. That is your definition number one. And then the second definition, you can say an engagement is an agreement between two persons of the same sex to conclude a civil partnership. Both answers are correct. You can give both answers. However, both answers are correct. So now that we know what an engagement is, we need to at least know what are the requirements, because there is specific requirements that we need before we finalize an engagement. Who wants to give it a try with regards to the requirements for engagement? Just give it a try. It's there is no right or wrong answer. And this is how you're going to learn, because if you give it a try and your answer is not correct, and I give you the correct answer, there is no way that you're going to forget it going forward. There is 4 requirements for a valid engagement. They're also highlighted on your study guide. If you did prepare for this session, I will give them to you. Okay, I see Clarissa said something on the chat. He said, both parties must agree to become engaged. That is correct. Thank you, Clarissa Pillay. I remember you from yesterday's session. Thank you so much. So for some reason, I can't hear a thing from my end. I'm sorry, I don't know what the issue might be. So I will ask that maybe you exit the session. That is a message from you. I don't want to pronounce your name wrong. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, is there anybody else that cannot hear me? Okay, let me phrase it this way. If you can hear me, please raise your hand. If you can hear me, please put your hand up. Okay, so it does look like, okay, thank you guys. You can go ahead and put your hands down. So those that cannot hear me, please, I'm going to type here because obviously you can't hear me. If you can't hear me, please. Okay, so I've replied to them. Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, so let's go back to the requirements for a valid engagement. So in order for an engagement to be valid, there is 4 requirements. Clarissa said here, both parties must agree to become engaged. So that is correct, Clarissa, thank you. So that is what we call consensus. So both parties must agree. So that is requirement number 1. So in one word, you can say it's consensus. And then the second requirement is, oh, thank you, Carissa. She says then again, both parties must be unmarried. That is correct. That's the point that I was going to now. So the second requirement is the capacity to act. Those of you that have done law of persons will probably understand what a capacity to act is. So that is the second requirement. And the third requirement is lawfulness. And then the last requirement is the possibility of performance. So let's go back to the consensus. So the consensus is between the parties with regard to concluding an engagement with each other. The parties must be in agreement about the engagement. So if there is any mistake, the first mistake we're going to talk about is called a material mistake. So if there is any mistake with regards to this contract of engagement, the engagement is void. So I will give you an example of a material mistake just now. And also, if one of the parties engages in misrepresentation or subjects to the other party to duress or undue influence, the engagement is voidable at the instance of the innocent party. I will also explain that. But first things first, let's talk about the example of a material mistake. A material mistake, I'll give you an example of, I'm just going to use random names, okay? So let's say, for example, John is dating Jane, and Jane is sitting at home, and then Jane receives an SMS from John's phone. And then in that SMS, it's a marriage proposal. And then without even thinking, Jane is excited that she's getting married. And then it turns out John didn't send the message, but the message was sent by John's friend. Let's call him Peter. So it's Peter who sent the message to Jane using John's phone, trying to propose Jane. So can I please that you mute your microphone? I'm not sure who it is, but please mute your microphone. Okay, so Peter used John's phone to send a message to Jane proposing her. So in Jane's mind, Jane believes that she is now engaged to John. And then it turns out it was Peter. That is a material mistake. So it's like mistaken identity. In my mind, I'm thinking that, oh, I'm now engaged, and then it turns out it was not the person that you thought it is. So that engagement becomes void because Jane and John, and the proposal was not from John, and Jane thought that he was getting engaged to John, not Peter. So that is an example of a material mistake which renders the engagement void. Before I continue, ladies and gentlemen, is there anybody with a question with regards to what I just said now? You can go ahead and raise your hand. If you're in a position where you're not able to talk, you can just type it on the chat box. Okay, moving on. So now, when I was talking about the material mistake, we said if ever it happens that there is a material mistake that renders the engagement void. Who can tell me what void means in engagement terminology or in family law terminology? Who can give it a try? Because you will get that question in your assignments or in your exams or something like that. Who can give it a try? What do we mean when we say that the engagement is void? Okay, a void engagement is a contract, it's an engagement contract that is regarded as non-existent, and it doesn't have any force and effect as if it never happened. So when the engagement is void, it's like that engagement never happened at all. It's not even considered. So now that we have spoken about a void engagement, we're going to talk about a voidable engagement. So let's say, for example, this will be an example of a voidable engagement. Let's say Jane and John. We're going to use Jane and John this evening. So Jane and John are in a very happy relationship. And then John decides that he wants to get married to Jane, and then he proposes to Jane, and then Jane agrees to the engagement, obviously. And then it turns out that John has always misrepresented himself to Jane. A perfect example will be John has told Jane that he comes from this super rich family. They've got big houses, big cars, and everything. So in Jane's mind, she is in love with this person that comes from a very rich family. And then if it does happen that during the course of the engagement, if Jane figures out that John is not this person that he always claims to be, that engagement is voidable. So now you're going to understand the difference between a void engagement that we spoke about and the voidable engagement that it is now that we are talking about. We said the void engagement is as if it never happened. And then now the voidable engagement is a valid engagement, but it can be voidable at the instance of the innocent party. So now we have John and then we have Jane. And then the innocent party in this matter is Jane. Why is she the innocent party? Because she is the one that has been lied to. So if she wants to terminate the engagement, then she can go ahead and do so because John misrepresented himself. So she can terminate that engagement with no consequences. We're still going to talk about the consequences of the engagement and how the engagements can be terminated lawful and unlawful. So if Jane now wants to terminate the engagement because John misrepresented himself, that engagement is voidable from the time that Jane agrees, because she never knew that John doesn't even come from the family that he thinks he comes from. So she can terminate the engagement on those grounds. So now that brings us to the definition of the term voidable engagement. So a voidable engagement is still an engagement contract, and it's a valid engagement contract for all purposes unless and until the innocent party obtains a degree of nullity. Right? It is an engagement, it's a valid engagement. So when we say it's a valid engagement and it's voidable at the instance that Jane wants to break this engagement, it also means that if Jane figures out that John lied to her, but she still wants to go ahead and get married to John, she can still do so if she does along the way and say, no, but wait a second. John lied to me. I thought I was getting married to this prince, and now he turns out he is not. So let's break this engagement. Jane can do that without any consequences. Does anyone have a question? Ladies and gentlemen, anyone with a question, comment, anything? You guys make me feel like I'm talking to myself. For me, I'm on track. Okay, thank you. Anyone else wants to comment? I will give you, thank you, Clarissa. I will give you more examples of misrepresentation that can render an engagement contract voidable. Thank you, Black. So there are more examples, like if one party, what's the perfect example? If one of the parties, let's say, for example, let's say Jane, along that relationship, before they get engaged, and then they go ahead and get engaged, and then before they get married, and then Jane becomes mentally ill. So that also is a ground for breaking the engagement. John can go ahead and be like, so now Jane is mentally ill. We all know, we all know that if somebody is not mentally capacitated, or if a person is mentally ill, they're not thinking straight. So that also forms a part of a voidable engagement. So John can go ahead and break that engagement because now John is not engaged to the same person that he actually proposed to. So mental illness can also be a ground to a voidable engagement. And then another example, this will be the last example that I'm going to use before we go on. Let's say, I'll come back to you now, Precious. Let's say if John John becomes an alcoholic, or if along the way, along that relationship, Jane finds out that John has now turned to be an alcoholic or a drug addict, then she can actually break that engagement if she wants to, if she doesn't want to spend the rest of her life with a drug addict or an alcoholic. So that is another perfect example that we can use as a misrepresentation that renders the engagement voidable. So I have a question from Precious. She says, if a friend wants to get engaged and ask you what law stipulates regarding a legally binding engagement, how would you advise? So Precious, and like an engagement, so there is no formula or a format for engagement. So as long as all the requirements are met, that is consensus, capacity to act, lawfulness, and possibility of performance, then that engagement is legally binding, right? I'm still going to explain. The capacity to act is the one for mental illness, and lawfulness is if the other party is unmarried. So I forgot the point that I was trying to get to. So the engagement can either be, okay, thank you, Precious. So the engagement, there is no particular format. You can propose via SMS, you can propose via WhatsApp, you can write a letter, you can propose over the phone, you can propose in any way. You can even propose on Facebook if you like. But I see that Hen Sherry, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Hen Sherry. She says an engagement is an offer and acceptance. That is correct. Somebody's microphone is on. If you can please mute it to avoid disruptions. So when we say an engagement is an acceptance and offer, just to expand on Hensheri's point, which is 100% correct, what that means is that the engagement only becomes valid if the other party accepts that offer. So if John is now trying to engage to get engaged to Jane via a WhatsApp message, it doesn't mean that because John has sent the WhatsApp message to Jane, now they are engaged. And also, it doesn't necessarily mean that if John sends that WhatsApp message to Jane that, oh, hey, can you be my wife? And then Jane jumps up and down and be like, yes, 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 yes. And then it was over a WhatsApp message and she did not send the yes back to John. They are not engaged. They are only engaged at the time that Jane responds to John and be like, yes, I will marry you. So when John receives that that reply from Jane, then they're engaged. That's how it works. So let's say, for example, if Jane sends a message back to John, and it does happen that that message is not delivered, or something happened along the way, and they both believe that and John is still not engaged, but Jane now believes that they are engaged. It is only until the time that John receives the response from Jane, that is when they will be officially engaged. I want to touch on a very important aspect with regards to the date. So when I gave you the definition for an engagement, I said it is an agreement between a man and a woman, or between same-sex couples to get married at a future or determinable date. So who can give it a try and tell me what is it that we mean when we say to marry each other on a specific or a determinable date? What does determinable date mean? Those who attended the session yesterday, they will know that I said when it comes to law, if you want to become a lawyer, or if you've watched like the legal series, or if you watched like court proceedings, you will know that lawyers like to play around with words. So if John and Jane said, okay, cool, we're getting married, but we're getting married at a determinable date, what exactly does that mean? Anyone wants to give it a try? Okay, so a determinable date, it usually refers to, there is no time, there is no like a specific time, but it has to be, it has to be a reasonable date. So you can't get engaged just for the sake of saying that I'm engaged, and then you're like, we'll get married in 5 years. It doesn't mean that the engagement becomes null and void, or it becomes voidable. But the courts don't see it as reasonable to say, but wait, well, hold on a second. How do you think that this person will feel? Or if you're like, okay, we just getting engaged, but there is no date. We don't know when we're getting married. There is no date. And then the other party now, the one at the receiving end, it can now be like, hey, we've been engaged for 6 or 7 years, and then what's happening, what's going on? So it's something that both parties need to communicate, but the dates need to be reasonable. I see you said, I think it is the date that sits well with them both. Yes, that is 100% correct, but it needs to be a reasonable date. So if a date has been set, okay, I just got a disruption here. I see we have 10 minutes left. So what's going to happen is that in 10 minutes, the session will cut off, which will be the first half of the session. And then we will continue. You'll use the same link to come back in. Immediately, I will restart the meeting, and then we can continue from there. If it happens that it does cut you off, ladies and gentlemen, it's like it will be 10 minutes before it cuts off. So we will continue if it does cut off. There's a comment that says, I think, oh, okay, that's still the same comment. Okay, let's continue. So if a date has been set, there is a duty to marry on that date. Let's say now John and Jane, they have said, oh, we're going to get married on the 15th of December 2022. So when they set the date, now they have a duty to get married on that day. So if anything goes south, or they don't have money anymore, can the date be changed? Yes, it can be changed by mutual agreement. So if there is no date, the issue that we spoke about just now, if there is no firm date, both parties must later agree on a date for the marriage. So that is Jane and John, they must sit down and be like, hey, look, we are engaged, and let's find a reasonable date. Not we're gonna get married in 2030, you know, it's just unreasonable. So they should agree on a date and an understanding that their marriage will take place within a reasonable time. If one party keeps postponing, it can also be considered as a breach of contract. So now we understand the term engagement and the requirements. So now let's talk about before we move on to the termination of engagement, does anyone have a question? Anyone? You guys are very quiet today. Okay, let's go on. Let's talk about the termination of an engagement. So we have two types of terminations. We have a lawful termination, and then we have an unlawful termination, but we will get there just now. So when do you think the engagement terminates? Anyone wants to give it a try? When do you think an engagement can be terminated? Okay, so number one, the engagement can be terminated when the couple gets married. So they engage, they set a date, and then they go ahead and get married. I do, and then the engagement is now terminated. Now they are in a new phase that we call marriage. Thank you, Carissa. Carissa says by mutual agreement between both of them. That is correct. So the second point is by death of either parties. Ooh, I can see Clarissa is way ahead of me. Okay, the second point is by the termination, is by the death of either party. So if one of them dies, then the engagement is officially terminated, of which we call it has been terminated by both. And then the third point will be when there is a mutual agreement between the parties to terminate that engagement. So if they be like, hey, Jane, or hey, John, it looks like this thing between us is not working. And then John will be like, oh yeah, I noticed that this thing is not working. So let's terminate the engagement. In a real world, obviously, and engagement can, when people break up, they don't do it like that. But I mean, some people do that, who knows? So they can agree and be like, hey, look, this thing is not working. How about we just break up? And then they terminate it, they agree, and then the engagement is terminated. And another very, 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 very important point, if one of the parties to an engagement is a minor. So for those of you that do law of persons will have covered the age of minority. Who can tell me what's the age of minority in South Africa? When we say somebody is a minor, it's between which ages? When we say somebody is a minor, nobody knows? Okay, so a minor is anyone under the age of 18. So yes, thank you, Fifi. So if one of the parties is a minor, remember for a minor to get engaged, we're going to deal with this on the next on the law of persons. It's more relevant to those of you that do law of persons that I'm probably going to meet tomorrow. So if a minor gets engaged, they need parental consent. So it means that if a minor gets engaged without the consent of the parents, the engagement is void. So let's say now the minor was given the consent by the parents, and then that minor is now engaged. Let's use Jane, for example. Jane is a minor. Jane is 16 years old, let's say 15. Jane is 15 years old, and then John is 31. And then John wants to marry Jane. It means that Jane will need the permission of her guardian or parents so that he can be engaged to John. And if Jane's parents agree to this engagement, then they will give consent, and then Jane and John can be engaged. But at any given time during that engagement, if Jane's parents feel as though they don't want their daughter to be engaged to this man, then they can terminate, or they can withdraw the consent at any given time before they get married. They can be like, hey, look, Jane, we don't want you to be engaged to this guy, so now we're pulling off the plug. Then the engagement gets terminated immediately. So that is another point. We went a little bit out there. And then the other point that we're going to talk about, it's called a unilateral lawful termination. That it has a Latin name. I don't know if it's there on your study guide. It's called a justa causa. So in English, it's a just cause. So it's almost the same thing. So a just cause is a fact or an occurrence which comes about after the engagement has been entered into, and which, according to human experience, will seriously jeopardize the chances of a happy and lasting marriage. Yes, Precious, is justa causa. I don't know if I'm pronouncing right. I'm not Latin, but yeah, so that is a justa causa. And then the unlawful termination or breach of promise. Usually this one is tends to be a very interesting one. Ladies and gentlemen, this session will terminate in less than a minute. I'm just going to stop the session, and then I will restart it again in just a second. Just give me a second. We're going to be back.